This is going to be long, it's going to be dull, it's going to ramble, and it's going to provide plenty of opportunities for anyone who wants to be skeptical to argue against me. It's not that I expect anyone to say anything negative about this, it's just that I want this to be as honest as I can be. A few months ago, I was sitting at my computer and I started to think about the universe contracting and expanding, and I thought to myself, maybe everything repeats itself. And even though I've always been afraid of death, I never felt like I did that night before. I thought to myself immediately afterwards, no, it's too unlikely. We must come through once and then be gone forever. I started to think about my kids and about them living long and happy lives ultimately to die and stop existing. Maybe it sounds greedy, but I couldn't bear the thought of them not existing, even if I was dead and unable to be affected by it. The worst feeling of despair I've ever felt settled over me, so I went downstairs and I sat next to their beds, feeling like I'd been punched in the stomach. The thought of annihilation, it just hovered over me, ultimately for about 3 months. My wife blamed it on me having had 2 back-to-back cases of the flu and strep, or maybe a lack of sleep or some combination thereof, giving me temporary depression, which actually made me feel better when I read about other people who got depressed after being ill. But it did nothing to alleviate the immediate symptoms of the hopelessness and dread. There were nights where I came home and I just sat in our bedroom and I quietly cried to myself, even though I never really cried about much anything. Through it all, I kept thinking, all of my problems would be solved if God was real. I want to make it plain that I eventually sought faith because I wanted it to be true, a predicament of which I remained aware the entire time I was considering it. I'm getting ahead of myself though, and I'd like to provide background. I grew up with my mom who always claimed to believe in God but never really acted on it. I asked her how she knew God was real, and she basically offered Pascal's wager. Not that I was old enough to know what that was, but her argument really put me off of the idea of God, because I assumed that everyone must have such shallow faith. My grandma was much more religious, a Catholic, and I always enjoyed going to her church and hearing them talk about the Bible, but I never really felt a personal connection to any of it. I've always considered myself to be agnostic, until a few months ago, which in hindsight I've come to realize may have coincided with my depression, when I decided that I should make a stand, or something equally stupid, and declare myself an atheist. For some reason, in my mind, the default position was that there was no God, and there was no reason to believe in him without some kind of material or objective proof. Obviously, since I said a few months ago my depression started, you'll be able to deduce that I haven't really believed for very long, but I've wanted to tell people about this for the past few weeks. 3 to 4 weeks ago, I felt terribly depressed that I wanted to die. I wasn't thinking about suicide or anything, but I felt like simply existing was too much of a burden because I couldn't get looming annihilation out of my mind. I know there are people with much realer problems than what mine was, and I know it sounds like a lot of whining, but I was totally lost. I got down on my knees that night and I prayed. I started off asking for a sign, but I realized that I would quickly dismiss any sign as a coincidence, because there'd be no way to objectively prove that it was God communicating with me. So I just asked that if God was real, he would give me a sense of certainty. Then I went to sleep, feeling more hopeless than I had up to that point. When I woke up the next morning, I felt great. I was happy for the first time in 3 months, and I felt like my depression was totally gone. I couldn't, and still can't, help being skeptical, but I felt like there was some hope. I'd always been kind of envious of Christians for their faith in something greater than us, but again, I always wrote it off as something shallow that they invented just to comfort themselves. I read St. Augustine's Confessions a couple years ago, and it moved me to the point that I talked to some of my Christian friends about it, but I still never felt that physical connection. But the morning after I prayed for certainty, I woke up feeling like I had the smallest thread of a connection to something bigger than me. I kept thinking about it and trying to convince myself that it was real, and being unable to stop myself from trying to convince myself that it wasn't real. But weird things kept happening. Stray thoughts I would have in my head during the day would seemingly find their way by coincidence into things that I was watching or reading in the evening, as if something was trying to tell me, I'm here. I won't go into details of all the coincidences because they're boring and easy to be written off as just that. But there are a few coincidences that have meant something to me. After that night when I prayed for the first time in probably 20 years, I started to read the Bible. I started to read C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity, and I started to go to church. I wasn't even thinking about what day it was when I went and took my family to church for the first time. But it was Palm Sunday, and it felt fitting that we should be there just before the celebration of Christ's resurrection, as faith was being resurrected in my own heart. When I was reading the Bible, and about the Bible, the motif of blindness kept jumping out at me. Paul being stricken blind, Jesus healing the blind. I got a migraine the day after I prayed, despite feeling better. But I got weird migraines where there's no real pain, but my vision becomes obscured. But it reminded me of blindness again. I joined a Bible study group with a cousin, and one of the guys in the group is blind. My son made a paper Easter bunny at school out of toilet paper roll. My 2-year-old daughter found it, ripped the eyes off, and left it sitting on my desk. I know it's all mundane stuff, but I feel like it's no more foolish to look for meaning in it than it is to dismiss it out of hand. What helped me the most was realizing that everyone must have some doubt. I don't think anyone is ever 100% sure all the time. And if any of you are, I'd love to hear about it because I wish I could be. I've come to realize that maybe rationality or intellect, not that I'm intellectual, can be a barrier to faith, because we become so focused on understanding the world that we begin to demand evidence for everything. The thing that really secured things for me happened 2 nights ago. Again, I know this whole thing might sound stupid, but I was taking a shower after work, and during my shower, I prayed again. The same basic prayer I've been saying every day lately. Hey God, thanks for everything. Sorry I'm terrible. I know I keep asking even though you keep giving them, but could you give me a sign? Thanks. I got out of the shower and I got dressed. My mom and stepdad were visiting us and they offered me a Diet Coke, and for some stupid reason I thought to myself, I don't think Jesus would drink Diet Coke. I know that's stupid and silly, but it didn't feel like it was totally my thought. For some reason I felt compelled to get out a bottle of wine I've avoided drinking for a few years now. A friend of my wife gave it to us almost 3 years ago, and neither of us drink wine very often. When I say friend, it's merely more of an acquaintance, as we haven't even seen her or spoken to her since the day she gave us the wine. Anyway, no more than 5 minutes after I'd opened the wine and poured it for everyone, the phone rang, and it was the lady who had given us the bottle calling to tell my wife about something. I know everything can be written off as a coincidence, but it was still a pretty big coincidence, and it's enough for me for now. If you're trying to find faith, I guess my advice is to stop thinking about it so much and just try to experience it. Read some apologetic stuff if that helps you, but I think the biggest barrier to people like me, and maybe you if this is your problem too, is that it's hard to rely on intuition. Our culture seems to prize deduction to the point where I think we've lost touch with balancing deduction and intuition. This is really long, and I think I'm just going to end it here.